start, thank you everybody for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Todd Anderson. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the Cummings School of Medicine for the last year and a half or so, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Rachel McKenna Memorial Lecture. Always like to start in a good way by acknowledging that we are on the traditional lands of the people of Treaty 7. That includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as Métis Nation of Alberta, now we say District 5 and 6. And we do this as a sign of our commitment to truth and reconciliation, and acknowledging that we have the privilege of living and working and thriving on this land. And we commit to moving forward in a good way with our Indigenous colleagues. So this is a special day for us. We're absolutely thrilled for Dr. West to be here from the University of Alberta to resurrect this lecture. And so, as you may or may not be aware, is that Dr. McKenna was a transplant pathologist here in Calgary in the late 90s until the time of her passing in 2003. Spent a lot of time before that at the University of Manitoba. And she was an active researcher, and so she did a lot of things for solid organ transplant many years ago, and because of her commitment and passion to that, after her battle with cancer, is that in 2003 a lectureship was initiated in her name, and monies were raised. And there was a series of lectures from 2003 for about a decade or so, really to highlight the importance of solid organ transplantation, the research that goes into that, the patient care, and the advocacy. And we're absolutely thrilled that we're able to bring that back. This is the first lecture in 10 years, and can think of no better person than Dr. West to reinitiate this lecture series. I think it needs to be said that a lot of the driving force for this came from our late colleague, Dr. Leanne Tibbles, who had her own passionate battle with cancer and succumbed to that in the recent past. And I think we need to think about all the important work that she did to make this a reality. Leanne, as you know, was a transplant nephrologist who worked tirelessly in the organ transplant field, was a wonderful clinician and colleague, and a researcher and a great educator, and really helped create what was the Southern Alberta transplant program. And so a lot of the great things that have happened in that program we could thank Leanne for, and she will be sorely missed in this. In addition to that, she was a great raiser of money, and so she was able to help to raise endowment funds so that this lecture could continue. And so that's been passed over to Dr. Isaac. And Deb Isaac, all of you know, is a longtime friend and colleague of mine. I'm a cardiologist, or I used to be a cardiologist at least. And when they let me out of the office, I still get to do a little bit of that. So I know how important for our patients solid organ transplant is in cardiac, in liver, in kidney. And because of that, Deb was a passionate believer that transplant should have its own section. And so with others, she was able to make that happen. So in addition to the Southern Alberta Transplant Program, Deb is the inaugural head of the section of transplant medicine and has been doing wonderful things in that domain as well. So Dr. Isaac is a wonderful cardiologist, as everybody knows, who gets to deal with her, but passionate and leader in cardiac transplant, heart failure research, and wonderful global health work, really changing the landscape of cardiology in Guyana, which started as a very small project a number of years ago, really now is so important to that country. So Deb doesn't sleep, she's tireless, and in addition to all of those things, she just got off the plane 2 hours ago from Guyana, but has the energy to put this lecture together to be a real champion for transplant in our province. So Deb, I'd like you to accept our congratulations and our thanks for doing this, and you have the pleasure with your laptop of introducing our very renowned researcher and speaker, Dr. Laurie West. So Deb, thank you.
The reason I need my laptop is because there is just so much to say about Laurie, and this is going to keep me short, because otherwise I could just go on and on. So Lori West is a professor of pediatrics, surgery, medical microbiology, immunology, and laboratory medicine pathology at the University of Alberta, and is the director of the Alberta Transplant Institute. She is also the director of the Canadian Donation Transplant Research Program, which is a national research coalition funded for 10 years now by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. She's previously held the Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in heart transplantation. She's the past president of the Canadian Society of Transplantation and the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, and the immediate past chair of the Women in Transplantation International Initiative of the Transplant Society. She's a fellow of both the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and was appointed as an officer of the Order of Canada. Congratulations. A clinician scientist, she has long-standing interest and expertise in pediatric heart transplant and transplant immunology, particularly related to ABO glycoimmunology. Her pioneering, groundbreaking work on crossing ABO barriers has led to a global impact on infant heart transplantation. Today, infants can safely and successfully accept heart transplants of different blood groups, i.e. ABO incompatibility heart transplants, reducing wait times and reducing the organ donor crisis for infants worldwide. And the number of infants, the lives of countless infants are impacted by this. I can't even express how important that is. So you can see that this amazing clinician, scientist, colleague, friend, Dr. Lori West has spent the last several decades committed to improving organ donation rates and transplant care for children with heart disease across Canada and worldwide, advocating for patients in need of transplantation through her numerous leadership positions regionally, nationally, and internationally. Thank you so much, Lori, for agreeing to speak with us today at the 20th anniversary Rachel McKenna Lecture. And your topic that I'm very much looking forward to hearing is ABO as a histocompatibility system in transplantation, history, technology, and opportunities to address 21st century complexities. Thank you so much.
What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I have to plug in. It's really a wonderful pleasure to be here and see old friends and longtime colleagues, as well as fresh new voices and faces of trainees, as well as other people who are joining the transplant world. Are we okay? There's a lot of movement here.
There we go.
All good? Okay. Ready. Are we good? Okay. Perfect. Well, I didn't know Rachel McKenna myself, but I certainly knew her work, and I applaud it. And I'd like to just, because it had a real impact on the field of histocompatibility, which is essential to organ transplantation. And I'm going to talk about histocompatibility today. I'd like to present you with a little bit of history and a little bit of science, and I hope neither one is of bearing. But I'd like to first start by talking about my friend Leanne Tibbles. I came to know Leanne back when she was just, I guess we were both just starting our careers. She was a newly emerging clinician scientist, and coming back here to Calgary, I was in Toronto. I chose this picture specifically because of the many pictures I have that are perhaps happier of Leanne. I really wanted this one, partly because it shows her beauty. She was a beautiful woman. Her grace. This is in her home as she received an award from the Kidney Foundation of Canada not long ago. Her amazing bravery. She faced her illness with complete, amazing pragmatism, and helped us all move through those months with her, and her happiness. And you can see all of those in this particular picture. We were friends and colleagues for, as I said, for a long time. We were both the president of the CST, the Canadian Society for Transplantation. She was really, I think, just in capturing one thing about her, it would be her ability to challenge us to really look big. And you mentioned it, Todd, in her fundraising efforts, but really she chastised us very recently, actually, in a meeting where we were trying to raise money, and we were kind of here, and she just kind of scolded us and said, no, you need to be here. You need to be up here. We can change things if we do it with this kind of a vision. And so I remember that as we worked through some of those challenges for generating money for research, for example, but also in facing other challenges with grace and happiness and beauty. So I will give you a disclosure. I'm on the Scientific Advisory Board of Vivo Biologics, but that really won't influence this talk. So I thought we could maybe just go through some things related to my favorite transplant topic, which is ABO. The ABO blood system, as it's commonly called. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of it, because there's a lot, I think, of misunderstanding about the role of ABO in the field of solid organ transplantation. And I'm going to specifically talk about these four topics. I think that the rest of them we may not have time for, but I'd be happy to answer questions if you have some thoughts about it. And really, we'd like to think about, as we think about with HLA histocompatibility, or anything to do with transplantation, the antigens, the antibodies, and maybe some steps that we can take as we go forward. So I'm a transplant cardiologist. When I have a patient who needs a workup for transplant, we start with an immunologic workup toward understanding the complexities of the histocompatibility, histo meaning tissue, so matching, if you like, or differences between the donor and the recipient, a fundamental part of organ transplantation. And in every transplant program around the world, the donors are genotyped, all the donors are genotyped, all the recipients are genotyped. It's just a part of what you do when you think about organ transplantation. And we call that HLA matching, HLA workup, and so on. In the donors, this involves looking at their HLA genotyping, as I said. And in the recipients, we want to know, has this person bought antibodies that would make their transplant more risky? But it's all about balancing risk, because what is transplantation if not risky? It's a crazy thing to do, to take organs from one person and transplant them into another. So the science informs us as to how we can understand how to make that, what the risks are, and how to lessen those if we can. We work closely with our HLA teams to interpret the information, and we're very lucky that it's a rapidly, the science informs HLA, and the clinical decisions are made on risk assessment and available intervention strategies. But organ allocation is not regulated by HLA. So that's sort of where and this is what it kind of looks like. This is where the science has revolutionized the field of organ transplantation. This is what's called an HLA antibody screen, and this is now the standard of care for understanding the antibodies that somebody might have that would have an impact on the success of their transplant. These antigens, these HLA structures, are proteins, and Paul Terasaki revolutionized the field of organ transplantation when he found a way to take those little proteins and put them on beads, single antigens, single beads. And it revolutionized the field of transplantation. So now what you get, if you look at this, it's on the side is mean fluorescence intensity, and these are pictures of what antibodies stick to these beads that have the antigens on them. So in your patient's serum, if they have antibodies against HLA class 1, class 2, this tiny little HLA-A subtype 57, it goes on forever. But you can look at it now and you can say, this patient is highly sensitized. And these are the antigens to which they have antibodies. Therefore, I'm going to avoid, if I can, a donor that has those structures. And so you make these risk assessments. It's precise and it's standardized. It's standardized by the use of this technology called Luminex technology that takes all these little beads, runs them through a machine, and you can't change it. It's standardized. Even if you wanted to change it, you couldn't. So every transplant program worldwide, you can compare what we're doing in Edmonton or Calgary with what they're doing in India or Brazil or the Netherlands. And that makes it a very rich background for not only for research, but for understanding and making decisions in clinical medicine. So I just want you to keep that picture in mind. And that's just another example of it. So when we get to ABO, what's ABO? What is it? We know it as a blood system. We all talk about ABO blood group. And really, even the most complicated stories start with this simple premise. ABO. So this is Karl Landsteiner in Vienna. He won the Nobel Prize in 1930. But in 1900, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, he was interested in why blood transfusions make some people really ill and others not. And there was no understanding at that time of antigens or antibodies or really much about immune development. It's just that some people got really sick when they got a blood transfusion for massive blood loss, and they're all pretty sick anyway at that point, and others don't. Why is that? So he kind of thought, well, if I can model that in test tubes, maybe I can figure it out. So I think this is the most brilliant picture here. So I'm going to point on this one. Oh, I don't know if I have a pointer. Do I have? Can you see a pointer? Okay. So he took blood from himself and 5 colleagues, and he separated it into the serum here and the red cells here. And then, like they were different patients, he mixed the red cells with the serum of his colleagues. And lo and behold, when he mixed, for example, his own red cells here with all the serum from his different colleagues, nothing much happened really. Of course, also when he mixed his own cells with his own serum. But when he mixed other people's cells with, for example, his serum, it clumped. And visibly clumped, it agglutinated. And gradually by mixing these different combinations, a pattern emerged, it's really pretty simple, of 4 different patterns. And so he called A, B, naught. It wasn't O, the letter O was naught because it didn't clump, and AB. It's just so brilliant in his intuitive thinking there. So the ABO blood groups were described based on these differing structures on the cells, which turned out to be sugars, and clumping substances in the serum, which turned out to be antibodies. And that, of course, defined the evolution of transfusion medicine, and for the next 120 years, 123 years, has really allowed us to be safe when we transfuse patients, and has really, of course, been a major leap forward in medicine. But transplantation and transfusion aren't the same thing. And I'd like to just spend a little while talking about that. So the ABO system in organ transplantation, there are a few things you need to know about it. First of all, the genes, the first thing you need to know is H is the antigen that is expressed that defines blood group O people. So the antigen is called H, the blood group is called O. So the AB and H histo blood group genes encode for enzymes called glycosyltransferases that add sugar units to form these ABO sugars, the actual antigens. And not just red blood cells for transfusion, but the organs we transplant are decorated with these sugars. So it's not, the reason that we worry about ABO in transplantation is not because you're carrying blood, it's because the organs themselves have these structures. And it's not just in humans. The evolutionary pattern of these sugars and these sugar enzymes and so on is really very widely dispersed in phylogenetically in ancestry. So the other piece of information that you have to know is that we make these natural, and I'm putting it in big air quotes here because I don't like the word natural, but we all spontaneously make antibodies to those antigens that we don't have ourselves. And that starts in early infancy, around about 6 months of age. And these antibodies, these ABO antibodies that we make, can fix complement and rapidly cause destruction of an ABO. If you were to transplant, do a transplant in someone with those antibodies, it would rapidly destroy the graft, and I mean really rapidly. Like this cartoon depicting, wow, that's graft rejection. And this is what it looks like histologically. You can see this kidney here is just filled with thrombus because those antibodies activate complement, which activates the coagulation cascade as well, and you get rapid and widespread thrombosis of the graft vasculature. And on the bottom you can see micrographs of this phenomenon in a heart transplant where you get hemorrhage, widespread hemorrhage amongst the myocytes, and again thrombosis. So what is compatible and incompatible depends on whether you're working up a patient for a transplant and you're looking for donors, or you've got a donor organ that you're allocating and you're looking to what recipients it could be compatible. For blood group O individuals, since they make anti-A and anti-B antibodies, only blood group O donors are compatible. And you can work through that to look at what's compatible and incompatible, but it sets up exactly as you might say. So in other words, we make these antibodies spontaneously to the antigens we don't express. We're immunologically tolerant to the antigens we do express, and we don't make antibodies to those. And blood group O individuals make anti-A and anti-B antibodies, and so only O donors are compatible. And what happens then, and you can work through the other ones, what happens though is that this means that blood group O individuals are the hardest to transplant because they face more competition for organs than any other blood group. And so they're at a real disadvantage. And because of demographics in the way the ABO system works, not just in this country, but around the world, this places ABO blood group O individuals at a real disadvantage. So the way we figure how to do this in transplantation is based on the rules for transfusion. How you allocate organs is strictly regulated by their ABO blood groups, and those are based largely on assumptions, some of which I've just told you. And that is that ABO is simple, right? It's simple. How hard can it be? It's A, B, and O, whereas HLA is very complex. We assume that. We assume that A and B are kind of simple sugars, and that they're just the end, little bits at the end, the sugars at the end. We kind of lump them together and say A and B are not dissimilar. They're quite similar, actually. And we assume that the ABH structures on red blood cells are the same as those on organs that we transplant. We don't think about them as being any different. We just assume they're always there. So it's kind of like this. All cats have 4 legs. I have 4 legs. I'm a cat. So let's look a little deeper into those assumptions. We also assume that anti-A and I just told you, right? Anti-A and anti-B antibodies are there in everybody, invariably. And that the test that we do now for ABO antibodies accurately and reproducibly is measured by the test we use that we're going to talk about, called the hemagglutination assay. And that ABO antibodies are an insurmountable barrier to ABO incompatible organ transplantation. I just told you that. So those are all the assumptions that we make. And what I'm here to tell you now is they're mostly not true. They're mostly not true. And ABO issues in organ transplantation are largely governed by the rules for transfusion, not for transplantation. And I'm here to rant about this a little bit. So go back to the patient that we want to work up for a transplant. I showed you kind of a little bit about what their immune workup is. Well, here's their ABO workup. They get a recipient phenotype. That's what's your blood group. You know, it's a simple little test that's done with a drop of blood in a solution. Most of us probably know what our blood type is. It's not, and that, in the transplant workup, that helps us identify for our patient what antibodies they have. I'm blood group B, I must have anti-A antibodies. Therefore, I'm not going to be listed to accept an organ from an A patient. And this defines their entire transplant journey from the minute they're listed. We also get a donor phenotype, not a genotype like HLA, but a phenotype. That is, what's the donor blood type? It's very gross, it's just A or B. And this defines the allocation algorithm. And in contrast to HLA, genotyping just isn't done, even though the tools are there to do it in every patient, because we're doing it anyway for HLA, because it's not needed for transfusion medicine, generally speaking. In contrast to HLA, organ allocation is strictly regulated by blood group. So, just a few things to make you think about how that works. So, in contrast to HLA antibodies, ABO antibodies, I told you, are spontaneously produced without sensitization. The other big difference is that they remain largely an IgM isotype. For those of you not immunologists or that interested in immunology, there are different flavors of antibodies, and most antibodies to protein structures like HLA are IgG isotype. That's what we worry about with those histograms I showed you, measure IgG antibodies. But ABO is different because it maintains this IgM isotype as well, so we have to worry about both. In contrast to transfusion, where you would never intentionally do an ABO incompatible transfusion. Why would you? You know, the rules prohibit it, there's usually no sense in doing it, because we're not at a dire shortage most of the time for blood, but we are with transplants. We do not have enough organs to anywhere meet the needs of the patients who need them. So intentional ABO incompatible transplantation is actually something that is being done in specialized programs due to this chronic donor organ shortage. But we have to remove or avoid the antibodies, okay? So, similar to what we do for HLA, though, in organ transplantation, for safe ABO incompatible transplantation, we need to know the antigens expressed in the donor organ and the relevant antibodies produced in the recipient. Or, absent, equally important, we need to know if they're not there, because then that might offer us an opportunity to cross that barrier. And for this level of sophistication in transplantation, we need new tools, and we need to move beyond the mental framework of transfusion medicine. So I'm just going to skip through like the hard science here and the chemistry, unless there are chemists in the audience who want to hear all this. But the take-home point is it's not as simple as ABO. There are lots of sugars, and for the ABO system, there are 18, not 3, but there's 6 each of A, B, and H. And we, as clinicians, we don't know that because it's not commonly needed to know that, I guess. And these are not uniformly expressed in tissues and red blood cells. And A isn't expressed the same as B. They're different, and they're different in ways that we would take for granted for HLA, but we lump them together for ABO. And so these are the chemistry subtypes. These are the structures, the actual chemical structures of these antigens. And they're not, and the most important take-home point is they are not expressed the same way in the different tissues that we transplant and in the blood. They're kind of like Lego. You know, you've got building blocks here, but in the organs it's actually a little bit simpler. And so we began to look at these antigens in the different organs, and this was work that hadn't really been known before, that in heart, and again, the message is actually fairly simple. There's only one ABO type sugar that's expressed in the heart, and that's the subtype 2 glycan. And you can see it here. In kidney, it's a little more complicated because there are different tissue components of endothelium and epithelium. And so it's a little more complicated, but the bottom line is that subtype 2 glycans, these sugars, are the vascular target in lung and in kidney, are the vascular target in all the organs we transplant. Only that one. To make it even more fun and complicated, there aren't only subtype sugars, but there are subgroups of the blood groups. And that also influences the antigens. So it's getting less simple all the time, right? And these aren't as immunogenic in some cases. So we can actually transplant blood group B organs because they have fewer of these antigens and less of them. And so that's being done in kidney transplantation. The trouble is we don't genotype, as I've told you. And so if we just went back and adopted the HLA kind of rules of things, we would be able to offer opportunities for far greater kidney transplants and probably the non-renal organs as well if we paid attention to genotyping and we really understood the antigens and their expression on these tissues. I'm just going to skip through some of this. So what about the antigens? So ABO antibodies that assumption that they're always there, they're not always there. And here's the perfect example of of a few examples where they're not there, or in countries that don't have deceased donation programs. In Asia, there are many countries that don't have deceased donation programs, and people rely then for kidney transplantation on living donors who may be an incompatible blood group. And this is especially true in Korea and in Asia. But it's also true of different ages. And this was work that Deb mentioned that we discovered now 27, I think, years ago, when we transplanted the first baby. Babies don't have antibodies either. And so we showed, as I said, more than 20 years ago now, that it's safe to transplant hearts. And remember, transplanting a heart is not the same as transplanting a kidney. If you have that picture of hyperacute rejection that I showed you, heart transplantation, that patient's going to die. In kidney transplantation, there's likely a chance to go back on dialysis. And so the hesitation to cross these barriers and to go against the accepted practice is huge because of the potential catastrophic consequences. But we showed that, in fact, this was true, and it was as simple as that. Babies don't make ABO antibodies for the first few months of life, and therefore it's safe to transplant them with an incompatible heart. And the boy who first, so this is now being done all around the world, and has really increased the availability of organs for children who would die without a transplant because they have no other options for congenital heart disease that they're born with. So this has resulted in a wonderful increase in the availability of organs suitable for infants and a decrease in the wastage of organs that couldn't be used by anybody. And this is Caleb, who was the first patient. He was transplanted on Valentine's Day, 1996, and he's an engineer in Winnipeg now and has done just extraordinarily well, as our infant patients generally do, with his blood group AB heart in his blood group O body. Kidney transplantation is also done across ABO incompatibility and has good results. But this is what we see now is that although the survival is quite good, what you pay for that survival is an increased cost of immunosuppression and problems due to infection. So they're probably over immunosuppressed because we don't assess risk properly, because we're using tools for transfusion and not transplantation. So I'd like to just tell you how I think we can get beyond this. So how do we assess risk for ABO incompatible transplantation? How do we measure ABO antibodies? I've referred to it a few times, and it takes us right back to Lynchstein. This is how he clumped them together, and he took the serum and he diluted it out and so on. This is how we do it today. It's the same test. It's 123 years later, at a time when we have amazing sophisticated technology for just about anything, but not for the measurement of ABO antibodies. We do effectively the same test as Landsteiner did, which is we take serum, we dilute it out, we add red cells, and where it last clumps is what we call the titer. It's just like this. It clumps, and there you go. And you look at it. And you look at it in the lab, and this is how we make clinical decisions. And then we try and draw statistical significance based on a test that's really fundamentally flawed. It's not standardized. Deb might look at it and say, I think it's 1 in 16. I might look at it and say it's 1 in 64. Or she might look at it the same day and say it's 1 in 64. You know, it is, and the remarkable thing to me about this is that it's been known for years that this is a flawed test. Like, everybody knows it's a flawed test. And we kind of get this, meh. Well, it's all we have. And it's true, it is all that we've had for a long time. But I've just listed here all the different ways you can do a hemagglutination test. And every lab around the world does it differently. There's no standardization of this test. And maybe because it's done pretty well so far, maybe because it's transformed transfusion medicine, we haven't really perhaps needed a better test. But there's also, you take the same serum sample and change the conditions like this, and this is the array of results you'll get that's variable from place to place, from lab to lab, from person to person, and so on. And for anti-B, that was anti-A, for anti-B, there's not even a grading system that's done. So, do you find that shocking? I find that really shocking. So this is a major limitation to what we can do with safe ABO incompatible transplants, is the lack of standardization and the methodology. So this is how ABO and HLA antibodies have evolved. I've kind of described that. This is where we are now here with Luminex antibody detection, with the beads. With ABO, we're kind of still here. There have been some enhancements that have been made in the methodology, but we're kind of still here. And we want to go here. So we're going to skip ahead now to where I think we ought to be. And this is just a frank advertisement for new technology and a new way of thinking about ABO that I'm presenting to you interested people. This is Ann Halpin, some of you know Ann. She was a PhD student in my lab, and she's an HLA lab director in Edmonton. And so she set out during her PhD years to develop a Luminex test for ABO antibodies. It started by working with chemists who